Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Jenny DeLeon, and this is a podcast where listeners get the story behind every book. Joining me today is Gina Maier Vincent, author of the book Exquisitely Aligned. Gina is a master motivator, inspirational speaker, podcaster, TV host, and empowerment entrepreneur with a vivacious love for inspiring positive change in others. She guides people around the world to design and claim the future they desire and live exquisitely aligned. So, Gina, I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Jenny. So excited to be here.
So, let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and how you came to write your book.
Yeah. So my life has been a bunch of twists and turns, and I'm sure your listeners can feel into that and understand what that looks like. And uh, 17 years ago, my husband became very ill, and he was in kidney failure. I was going to be his transplanted organ. I was his match, and things went wrong. And I'll leave it at that. That's the Disney version. And it just quickly made me realize that life is really precious and it can be super short and it can turn like on a dime.
Yeah.
We had just brought our daughter home from Guatemala. She was now 2. Our son was in kindergarten, and my world was turned upside down. And I knew that there was something bigger. How would I say this? On a bigger scale for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew once he received a woman my age, my blood type, also an organ donor, passed, and he received her kidney, one of her kidneys and her liver, and he's breathing and enjoying the time he's gotten 15 years later.
Wow.
But yeah, what a miracle. But at the time, I thought I was going to write a book about the journey, what it was like to be a doctor's wife. And now I had to be in charge of his medical care.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, you know what, Jenny, I thought it would be so cool, like a kid's book where you flip it upside down and you read the other direction. And it would have been a story of being a doctor who became the patient in a broken system, these are my words, in a broken system.
Right.
And I'm glad I never wrote that book. He had no desire to write it. Although it would have been cathartic, I don't know that anybody would have enjoyed reading it. So I'm glad years passed, life changed. I expanded myself in my way of expressing myself and started my business. And yeah, and that's how it came to be. It's like having a third baby. So I have a biological son, a adopted daughter, and now a book.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get to that about your experience with your husband in just a second. But before we do, so your book is called Exquisitely Aligned. So
Yes.
can you tell us what that means to you? I just want to kind of set the stage for the audience so we're all on the same page.
Yeah. And I love that question. And I like that you do that to start there. For me, I believe we're all born exquisite. It's our birthright. And we're as unique as our fingerprint. And I think we should own it. But life can take us, life, social media, marketing, all those marketing campaigns. And listen, I studied marketing in college, so I was a part of that, can take us far away from where we are. But if we come back to that core, that essence, and align with our exquisiteness and drop away or peel away the layers that aren't really ours, I believe we can live in harmony with our deepest desires that sometimes we put on the back burner.
Yeah.
I believe we can show up unapologetically and really stand with our gifts and our talents in the forefront and not hide them. And I do believe we can decide who we want to be and essentially step fully into that vision. So that's exquisitely aligned for me. I know that's a long.
No, I love that because that explanation and even the words together, exquisitely aligned, right? As I was saying the word exquisite, I was like, exquisite. That's not a word I use very often. So I like the specialness even of the word, right? To choose that word in the title and when you're talking about in your business, everything. So I want to go back, like I said, about the medical issue with your husband. So
Yeah.
if the reader or the listeners can read your book for more details on the specifics
Yes.
of that. But what I got out of that story was, and maybe you can also tell us if this is where your desire to live exquisitely aligned, catapulted from, was you talked about you wanted to design this life, but it was kind of in your someday. It was far off, right? And then this issue happened with your husband, where you said in the book how you took a stand for him, right? For him, his health, and everything he was going through. And so taking this stand, realizing that, hey, someday honestly may not come given this
Right.
situation. So I have to prioritize my life now.
Yeah.
I think that it's such a relatable the decision to take a stand now is such a relatable thing that I think a lot of us go through. So can you tell us a little bit about like putting that stake in the sand in that situation and being like, no, today is the day I take control of this. What was that like for you?
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, Jenny, perfectly. I had a lot of blessings. I mean, I in 2006 when Sonia was born and we were matched with her, she was born in Guatemala and we brought her home. It was right before Halloween. And in October of 2006. In 2007, I just woke up every day very grateful that, I had this wonderful husband, the man of my dreams. We had a biological son who was healthy and happy and maturing beautifully. And our daughter was home from Guatemala. Like my world felt complete. Everything felt great. We had a beautiful house on a golf course. Neither of us are golfers, but the serenity, the
Hmm.
peacefulness most of
Right.
the time. Nobody was screaming,
Right.
duck or anything. But I guess for us, it was an expansive view, and I like that. But there was after Mark became healthy, and I was telling a friend who was older than I, married longer than I, and actually, this was before Mark was sick. I was just saying, like, I want more, and I couldn't find the rest of the words.
Yeah.
And she turned to me. She's also from New York. So we're both from New York, but living in Charlotte, didn't know each other prior. And she just reamed me. Like, who are you to want more? And she almost like, not with her hands, but in her head, I could see her checking off the boxes. College, check. Career, check. Marriage, check. And
Yeah.
she married a doctor, like, and I got an extra plus sign or
Yeah.
something in her mind. And in my mind, Jenny, I know this sounds awful, and I'm happy he studied and did what he wanted to do and became a doctor. But
Hmm.
at the same time, we all eat and use the restroom at the same way. Like to me, he's just another man.
Right. Yeah.
Because I'm not stepping in to ask for medical advice. I'm not seeing him in a white coat. He's my husband. And yes, he's a good guy, but there was like something missing in my life. And I call that now, finally. I've done a lot of research. I've done a lot of speaking, podcasting, and finally writing the book. And I call it underliving.
Yeah.
And I believe that when we long for this thing and we keep putting it off, like, oh, it's someday I'll be able to, because I believe, like myself, I was busy. I was
Yeah.
dropping off to preschool, to the school bus, and to the dialysis center. I was the only driver at this point. And, I only had two kids. I feel for the person who has four and becomes ill, or has more than, or the child who is ill, or the parent. I mean, but we get in this cycle of what some people use as a badge of honor. Someone called it, I
Yeah.
can't remember who it was, busyness.
Yeah.
And it's become someday. But when Mark was sick and I had to walk through the ER, um, uh, not ER,
For the
what is it?
dialysis.
Yeah, the dialysis and the not the emergency room, the ICU.
Uh-huh.
When the door is open, it's only natural for me, a nosy body. I was a department store buyer, so you're always looking at people and trends. What are they wearing? What's next? And so you peer in and like you could tell they're praying over some person who, and then you hear the code blues, you
Yeah.
come over the loudspeaker.
Yeah.
And then everyone's running and you just not, and the door's closing and the things are beeping and you're like, oh my God, someday for some of these people just doesn't come. The woman
Yeah.
whose organs he got was my age, 40 years old, and healthier than him. So it was a huge shock. I would hope no one else has to go through that, but to write the book was to say, hey, this is what I've been through. And, that's only the
Yeah.
first chapter, right? Because I
Yeah.
don't want to bore people with that story. I try to give the Disney version, but I just want to tell people, please don't put it on the back burner.
Right.
Like try every day, do something that brings you one step closer to whatever fulfillment you desire. And
Right.
it can change. Like the fun thing is I always tell my clients, like, okay, your list looks like this right now. And I'm showing small hands, but I see this grand thing. And it's okay to, like, I tell my husband, because I'm a female, I'm allowed to change my mind every 30
Right. Right.
seconds,
Right.
right?
Right. Well, and that gives you, once you start living that way, what started as the tiny box expands because you realize you're capable of more. You can do more. There is more. There's more available to me. And I wanted to touch on that more because you talk about in the book about 5 elements of exquisite alignment, and one of those is defining your more. And later on in the chapter, you talk about the woman who says, who are you? I don't know if the woman said this to you or your thought, who am I to want more, right? As you mentioned. And when I read this, it was really interesting to me because I had this conversation with a friend years ago about this, where she felt guilty for wanting more, right?
Yeah.
Similar situation. She had a husband, great life, um, did all these things, traveled and everything. But she wanted more in the way of like kind of the stuff that you do, right? With speaking and books and
Yeah.
having her own thing to share with the world. And she had this guilt of wanting more because it felt good to her, right? Good, not
Yeah.
better, best, whatever, but good. And I remember being somewhat puzzled by this when she first told me this, because I'm not going to say I've never felt like I don't deserve more, but I never felt like I couldn't have it. I always felt like it was available if I was willing to go after it. And some things I wasn't willing to go after, right? But
Right.
something I was. And so it's interesting for me when I read about that because, and all of this, our lives play into this. Why for one person it's a bad thing to want more, while another person might feel challenged by it, and everything. But and you mentioned also in the book about how wanting more is actually a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing. It's not.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with you for wanting more.
Yeah.
And I guess on that concept of more and defining your more and it going along with an exquisitely aligned life, like being okay with more and seeing what that opens up to you. Because you talk about later in the book about how more and being able to, it opened like in your journey, opening up more space, more time, more energy for the things that you were doing. And you talked about, and I could also when you gave an example of when you were younger and before you were married, and you and a friend had went to the symphony, and you got these
Yes.
awesome seats, and then this like domino effect of good things happen. And I've had experiences that in my life too, right? When we're in this state of like this higher energy state where we're going after what we want, we've given ourselves permission, are you doing all this stuff, and then you just automatically things line up for you. And
Yeah.
so I think that concept of being okay with more, but then even making space for the more. So do you want to comment on that a little bit about what that
Yeah.
means to you and maybe how some of the listeners could start to do that?
Yeah. First, Jenny, I have to say, this is the first interview I'm doing where the person has read the book. So I have goosebumps. I feel like I just want to jump through the camera and like sit beside you and like tell me more because to first let me touch on your friend who had those desires. I think there's a couple of levels. Judgment is a word that I've done a lot of studying on to educate myself. Like, how does this happen? Why does it happen? And I think it goes back from what I can, for what I read and got deep into, is I could relate it to living in a tribe
Mm-hmm.
and where men were thought to do one thing and the women the other. And so the yin and the yang all work together beautifully. And mother and father would be afraid if your friend left the tribe because she
Yeah.
might not be safe. That another tribe may hurt her or think she's an intruder or may think ill of her because she looks different, right?
Right.
And then there's the other part of she may not come back. She might like it better over there. Right. And we see this as kids start leaving the nest and going to school or, accepting jobs. My son just accepted a job, ironically, in Queens, New York. I
Oh,
grew up on Long Island, went to school
right.
in Manhattan and worked in Manhattan. So now he knows what cold is. They
Right.
used to make fun of me when I used to say I had to walk a mile in the snow and my
Uphill
ears,
both
Mom,
ways. Yeah.
now he gets it. He's like, I need to get away for the weekend. But someplace warm is the end of that sentence. But the other part is we judge ourselves. Who am
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
to want to desire more than what I have? And the more oftentimes is not things like sometimes it could be, listen, I love beautiful things. I always have. That's part of my human design is desire. I desire beautiful food versus like Taco Bell. And no offense against Taco Bell, it's just it doesn't look beautiful to me, the
Hmm.
colors, etc. Well, I haven't been there in decades, so maybe I shouldn't say that out
No, it
loud.
hasn't changed.
Been a long time. So,
Yeah.
but what I relate to as like what I ate maybe in college, and I enjoy beautiful surroundings. I enjoy beautiful paintings, and I think there's an exchange between the person standing in a museum and staring at a piece of art. And that exchange for me, it fuels me. And I think it fuels many, like just sitting outside. But to go back to your friend, because I went off on a tangent, it sounds like the word when you were speaking, I wrote impact lives. It sounds like her desire was she's wants to fulfill a legacy of touching people in a way, just like you do with your show, um, with a book, with anything, with an article, with a video, a YouTube channel.
Hmm.
And I think when we feel that call, for me, it's a calling.
Hmm.
I know sometimes when I say that to a prospect who's asking, hey, I might want to work with you, I'm like, do you feel like you have a calling? And they're like, oh, that's too much work.
Right.
But then when you start listening to them, it I'm like, okay, maybe it's a different word for you,
Right.
but it sounds like you want to become exactly what you see missing in the world. And you can be that. Um, what was the other part of the question, Jenny? Because now I forgot.
Right. The making space. And we were talking about
Oh,
making space for the more, I think.
yeah. I think that four-letter word busy and the four-letter F word fine comes into our lives too often. I receive it in emails, I receive it in voicemails. Sorry, I was busy. What are you so busy doing? Like, is it possible? I know. And I always tell my kids when I used to call them my daughter's still in college, and it's like, I'm busy. What do you need? And I'm like, okay, take a breath. Tell
Right.
me when you can call me back. Like, create some space. I used to call my son and ask him, are you having fun? He's like, fun? Like, I'm trying to get an A. And I'm like, yes, but 5 years from now, no one's going to care whether you got an A. You
Right.
know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and I know because I was him. Maybe
I
not
was
to
him
the,
too. Like I know exactly what you're talking about. Like it's not fun until I get to the end. Well, that's not really that as we're talking about making space, right? We've got to make space for the journey. We can't always just be looking at the end and trying to quickly get to the end and
yes.
go on to the next thing because then there is never any enjoyment.
And that's where, when you walk past people in the ICU, you realize that that's what life's about. It's not about the degree. It's not about the A on the project. It's not about the title. It's really about the journey, the experience, the
Yeah.
pleasure. Like the night that I ended up listening to Pavarotti for free after listening to the London Symphony Orchestra for free. Like it was just like all I paid for was the subway and a cab, and I split that with a girlfriend. It was like
Right.
insanity. But the doors do open. And I think I've been doing more speaking, which is one of my passions. And now that I had my shoulder and hip replaced, I can actually stand, raise my arm, and speak without crying in pain. So it's been fun. But the biggest thing that I get the comments at the end, like, "Wow, I'm glad you shared that story about going to the symphony." because it makes me realize like I had spoken to 21 women and seven of them raised their hand and all were in awe about that one thing about creating space. And when I wrote my speech and then when I shared it, that was not what I thought was going to be the
Right.
most impactful piece. But I thought, wow, that needs to be written in the book. You know what I mean? So I love that you even picked that up,
Yeah.
because I think it leaves room for expansion. It leaves room. I had recently a friend who went on a vacation and she was telling me about it. She's like, this was the first trip where we really just relaxed some. And I was getting all these intuitive hits. And I was like, this is the work I do. Like, when you're like sitting there going, oh my God, you're like, this is what I help people. Because
Yes.
sometimes when people are close to you, I'm not going to assume, but let me ask you, Jenny, have you ever had this happen? The people closest to you don't quite understand what you do
Oh,
for your
absolutely.
paid living.
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. That's been my whole life.
That's why I like you so much. I just turned 56 and it's still happening. But it's getting better now that people see me in print, like whatever
Right.
it takes, whatever it takes. But yeah, it's space allows for so many things to happen. And I think if we can just and listen, I'm a New Yorker. I can get into that craziness myself. But if we slow down and put 15 minutes between appointments or even 30, and whatever it is to clear your head, to recap, to think about, hey, that worked well. I want to do it again. Or that was a great question. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's these things like this, what we're talking about here, making space. To me, that's a foundational element, let's say, of being human, right? That's part of being human that we should know how to do. However, it's not something that we're taught as we grow up. And I was listening to something the other day about it was marriage related. I'm 2.5 years into being married, so learning a lot still. And we got married when we were older, so as you get older, it's
Finer. You are finer.
yes. So this thing I was listening to, it was a couple getting counseled by a therapist, and the therapist was asking them. He asked the husband, were you ever taught how to be married to a woman? And he said no. And then he asked the woman, were you ever taught how to be married to a man? No. And so we go through life with all these things that we think we should know, but we really don't know, right? Because nobody taught us, not because somebody didn't want to teach us. It's just there's all these other things you have to learn. So things like this that seem to, I don't know, they don't, there's not as much emphasis or focus on. And
Correct.
we get older and we learn these things, like why didn't anybody teach me that, and so I think this concept of making space, and again, I love the story about how that night went for you, because I've had many experiences like that with myself, when I've let the control go, when I have trusted that it's going to be okay, and stop trying to make it happen and let it happen, sort of your experience, right? So I love that concept of more, and even talking about, and there's a lot of detail in the book, and unfortunately we don't have time to go into all of this. I know you and I could sit here and talk for 3 hours about this, but um, I just want to touch on one quick thing before we wrap up. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but towards the end of the book, talk about inviting beauty and luxury into your life, and then you talk about having your own personal style and knowing what that is. And I
Yeah.
know every time I see you, you are always exquisitely dressed, your hair, makeup, everything is always done. You always you're, to me, very inspirational, because I feel like that's something that I'm not personally good at myself. Like I never feel like I knew, again, it wasn't something that I ever learned or picked up on, right? But this point of taking the time to do these things for yourself,
Yeah.
creating a personal style, getting up, getting ready, even if you're not necessarily going anywhere, to me,
Mhm.
that changes your energy, which changes
Yes.
the domino effect down the line to allow the more, right? Because it's not
Yeah.
just one piece. It's not just letting more come in. And you talk about it in the book, and you go into greater detail. But I think that's so important to invest in ourselves in that way too.
And I love that you brought that up. It's one of my favorite things, and I wanted it to be in the book. And I love, love, love my publisher. I mean, this book wouldn't have come to this level without her because I might know how to tell a story if we're talking in person like this, but not in a written format. So she
Right.
really brought it to life. But when I told her I really feel strongly about beauty, elegance, and luxury being in the book, she came back to me, which was perfect. And she said, but Gina, not everybody can afford that. So how are you going to like tell them to do that? And I just sat there and I was like, what are you talking about? And
Right.
she's like, what are you talking about? And it was funny. So she's like, okay, explain to me. And for me, beauty, elegance, and luxury is different for everybody. What I find,
Right.
you can see what part of my office looks like, one of the four walls, but this might not be beauty and elegance and luxury for you. And I think we can each allow ourselves 5 minutes. I just came back in because I prayed outside before the show, which I often do, pray or meditate or both,
Hmm.
um, in the yard. And the hummingbirds were with me. And I was like, oh, this is so like, that's beauty, elegance, and
Yeah.
luxury. And if we create 5 minutes to walk outside of our office, I work from home, but even if you're in a building where you can escape, I know I one time had a secretary who was always like, where are you going? I'm like, to the ladies' room? Like, is
Right.
it okay? Like,
Right.
that was a very odd experience for me. I got over it. It was a little traumatizing in the beginning, and she was a great secretary, but I felt like I was on a leash to her desk, Um, but I think that I'll give you an example, which is I don't believe in the book. I think I talk about it only. And I used to buy myself one Gerber daisy. I lived
Mhm.
illegally in someone's basement on Long Island in Nassau County and commuted to Manhattan. I was making $21,500. I had a car that thankfully my parents paid for. But I still had to pay insurance, gas, all the maintenance, had to pay rent to live alone illegally in this basement. If there were a fire, I would have died because the windows were not big enough for my hips to
Mhm.
fit through. When we had a blizzard, the door opened out, so I couldn't get out. The
Mhm.
snow came
Mhm.
down. I mean, it was in like looking back, I can't even believe I lived down there. But I could afford one Gerber daisy. And because this basement apartment got no sunlight, I treated myself every week. I
Yeah.
don't even remember if it was $3.48, but I would stop on the way home from the train and just get myself a Gerber daisy to bring nature into my space so that when I woke up and when I went to bed at night, I saw something, what I felt reminded me, like, and the thing about hair, makeup, and stuff is funny. My grandmother, grandfather, two uncles, and aunt through marriage owned hair salons in Germany.
Mm.
And then my grandmother here in America, my Italian grandmother, worked in the fashion industry. And I
Mhm.
think maybe part of that is my heritage, but I
Yeah.
think it's just part of my imprint. I feel better even during COVID when I got dressed, put on my
Yeah.
false lashes and my lipstick. And
Yes. Yes.
my kids were like, Mom, you're wearing a mask. And sure enough, when I took the mask off, I had lipstick, over my chin, over my nose. But I dress for me to feel like I am, you
You're
know,
you. Because
I'm a
you're,
package, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
and I think that if we can figure out what our style is, what is our message? We have 7 seconds to get across a message. Certainly, my message is not appealing to everyone. I get a couple of eye rolls. And then I think, okay, I got it. You know what I mean? If some people like the way I look and I offend some others, that's great because I live in California where most people have light hair. I was born with super dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, but they have light hair and it's super long. I don't want long hair. It's just too much work for me, you know?
Yeah. I do know
So,
actually because my hair is long. So yes, I do know. And so yes, Gina, we're coming to the end of our time. Unfortunately, we could, like I said, we could talk for hours about this. I want to thank you for joining us today. My guest has been Gina Maier Vincent, author of the book Exquisitely Aligned. And so, Gina, before we close out today, in just about a minute, can you tell us what you hope the readers learn or take away after reading your book?
yeah, I hope everyone has their own unique journey. For me, when I get to autograph someone's book, I say a bespoke journey to their soul and be able to let go of things that no longer serve them. I know you know about the rise scale in there with friendships, and it
Hmm.
could be anything, but to maybe, I like to say, lift a few veils off so they can see things differently, maybe change their mindset, and whatever that
Yeah.
is for them.
Yes. So, well, Gina, the book was amazing. I loved it. It's going on my shelf. I have a shelf in my headboard on my bed. So, and those are my favorite books that go in there. So, your book is going in there. So, again, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a great interview.
Yes, thank you. You're amazing.
You can find more about the book, Exquisitely Aligned, on Amazon and through Gina's website, and I'll link to the show notes. So, be sure to check that out. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear the podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. I'm Jenny DeLeon, and I hope you'll join us for the next Books on Air podcast. Remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. Thank you so much for listening.